Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at one of the most under-examined questions of the Second World War. Why experienced German commanders came to see relatively green American soldiers as their most dangerous opponents. This isn't a story about heroism. It's a story about institutional learning, rapid adaptation, and the brutal logic of industrial warfare. Let the facts speak for themselves. February 1943. The war in North Africa had been grinding on for months. British forces had pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps westward across Libya, while fresh American troops landed in the west, moving east to trap the Axis between two fronts. On paper, the situation looked manageable. On the ground, it was far more complicated. The American Second Corps held a wide, exposed front across the mountains of central Tunisia. Its commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had set up his headquarters roughly 70 miles behind the front lines. Engineers spent 3 weeks building an elaborate underground bunker while his troops held scattered positions in the mountain passes with no coherent plan and no clear sense of where the enemy was massing. Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir that this was the only time during the war he saw a senior command so focused on its own safety that it had dug itself underground. Fredendall used a private personal code to communicate with subordinates, leaving unit commanders guessing at his intentions. He rarely visited the front. His troops were exposed, disorganized, and largely unaware of what was coming. On February 14, 1943, the German 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at Sidi Bouzid. The American defenders had no chance. Tanks that tried to counterattack were destroyed by German armor moving with practiced coordination. Infantry positions collapsed under the combined weight of tanks, artillery, and close air support. By the night of February 16th, Second Corps had lost around 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. The 168th Infantry Regiment had taken in 450 new replacements just days before the attack. Many had never finished basic training. Some arrived without rifles. Bazookas, the main American anti-tank weapon, reached the front on February 12th, just 2 days before the assault. Units pulled back without orders. Communications collapsed entirely. Panic spread through rear area headquarters. The Germans pushed through Kasserine Pass on February 20th, driving nearly 50 miles into the American rear. Total American casualties reached around 6,300 men, against fewer than 1,000 German losses. It was a thorough, professional dismantling of an inexperienced force by veterans who had spent 2 years fighting across the North African desert. German soldiers who fought at Kasserine remembered it with professional contempt. American officers had failed to coordinate their forces. Artillery support was scattered and poorly directed. Infantry broke and ran when German armor appeared. The conclusion German commanders drew was straightforward and, from their perspective, entirely reasonable. These amateur soldiers from across the Atlantic posed no serious threat to the Wehrmacht. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding Axis forces in Tunisia, noted in his papers that the Americans had been routed quickly and completely. He wrote that their tactical conduct in the opening phase had been poor, and that their units showed little ability to recover under pressure. This wasn't a grudging assessment written in hindsight. It was an honest professional evaluation of what he had seen. And yet, in the final days of the Kasserine battle, something had begun to shift, something Rommel himself noted with unease. As German forces pushed toward the key Allied supply depots at Talla and Tebessa, they met resistance that hadn't been there before. American artillery, badly coordinated at the start, began concentrating its fires more effectively. Scattered reserves started appearing at critical defensive points. The German advance slowed. Then it stopped. Then it reversed. Rommel had expected to exploit a complete breakthrough. Instead, he found an enemy that was learning to fight even in the middle of losing. The Americans had been badly beaten, but they hadn't broken. Something in how this army was built allowed it to absorb catastrophic failure and begin correcting itself while the shells were still falling. What followed over the next 60 days would shock every German commander who had assumed the matter was settled at Kasserine Pass. Within 72 hours of the disaster, General Eisenhower conducted a thorough and unsentimental assessment of what had gone wrong. He didn't look for excuses. He identified specific failures in leadership, training, coordination, and doctrine, then acted on every one of them. Friedendahl was quietly removed from command and sent back to the United States, where he spent the rest of the war training replacement troops. The decision was deliberate and clinical. The Army wasn't interested in assigning blame. It was interested in finding what had failed and replacing it with something that worked. On March 6, 1943, Major General George Patton arrived to take command of Second Corps. What Patton found was an army in genuine disarray. Officers kept their distance from the front. Discipline had gone slack. Soldiers ignored uniform standards and basic military customs. Units fought as scattered fragments rather than coordinated combined arms teams. Artillery, armor, and infantry rarely communicated. The organization Patton inherited barely resembled a functioning military force. Fighting and lead directly. When Major General Orlando Ward mentioned that 1st Armored Division had the good fortune of losing no officers that day, Patton made clear this was not good fortune. Officers who weren't sharing risks with their soldiers weren't doing their jobs. Patton restructured Second Corps so that infantry, armor, and artillery operated as coordinated teams rather than parallel branches. He set clear chains of command and enforced discipline with a severity that left no room for interpretation. He demanded maximum air support for every operation. He pushed his staff to produce clear, executable plans, then held commanders personally accountable for results. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was structural, immediate, and comprehensive. Patton accomplished in 3 weeks what military reformers typically need years to achieve, through sheer force of will applied simultaneously to every level of the organization. On March 23, 1943, just 6 weeks after the humiliation at Kasserine, the 10th Panzer Division attacked near El Ghoutar in central Tunisia. This was the same German unit that had torn through American positions in February. Its commander assembled roughly 6,000 men, 50 operational tanks, a company of tank destroyers, and an assault gun battery. The Germans expected another easy victory. At 6 in the morning, 50 German tanks rolled out of a mountain pass into the El Ghoutar Valley. They advanced quickly, overrunning American frontline positions. 2 tanks came so close to 1st Infantry Division headquarters that staff officers urged their commanding general to pull back. Major General Terry Allen refused to move. He reportedly told his staff he wouldn't leave and would shoot the first man who did. The German advance had covered roughly half the distance to El Ghoutar when it hit a carefully prepared American minefield. 8 tanks were destroyed immediately. The formation's momentum faltered as crews tried to find a way around. American artillery forward observers, carrying portable radios, began calling in concentrated fire from multiple batteries using techniques developed and refined over the previous decade at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Tank destroyers from the 600 1st Tank Destroyer Battalion, hidden along the valley walls, opened fire on the stalled German armor. By 9:30 in the morning, the Germans had lost 30 tanks and were retreating back toward the pass. The attack had been stopped cold in under 3.5 hours. That afternoon, American signals intelligence intercepted German radio traffic revealing plans for a second assault later that day. The Americans were ready. When German infantry advanced in the late afternoon, Artillery used the time-on-target technique, calculating firing solutions so that shells from multiple batteries at different distances would all arrive at the same moment. There was no warning, no time to take cover. One moment the field was quiet. The next, hundreds of rounds detonated simultaneously across German positions. For the first time in the entire North African campaign, American forces had stopped a full Panzer Division attack, and then launched successful counterattacks of their own. The transformation from Kasserine to El Guetar had taken less than 2 months. German commanders were now facing something new, something they hadn't anticipated, and something they didn't yet fully understand. German commanders analyzing what had stopped them at El Guetar focused on 2 things above all else. The first was American artillery. The second was American air power. Both represented advantages so substantial and so deeply structural that no amount of tactical skill at the unit level could fully compensate for them. The foundation of American artillery superiority was a system developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Officers spent years building what became known as the Fire Direction Center, a method of centralized fire calculation that allowed artillery batteries to mass fires on targets with unprecedented speed and coordination. The genius of the system was its simplicity in execution. A forward observer with a portable radio could call in battalion-level fire within about 3 minutes of spotting a target. The observer didn't calculate range and bearing himself. He reported the target's location. The Fire Direction Center computed firing solutions for every available gun at once. If more firepower was needed, the request moved up through division and corps headquarters, potentially bringing hundreds of guns to bear on a single point within minutes. The technique that most unsettled German soldiers had a technical name in American doctrine: time on target. Artillery commanders calculated their solutions so that shells from multiple batteries at different distances, firing at different angles, would arrive at the same point within 3 seconds of each other. There was no sound of rounds growing louder, no chance to dive into a trench. All the shells arrived together, without warning, and the area simply ceased to be a survivable place to stand. German veterans who lived through American artillery barrages described the experience in terms that went beyond tactical assessment. It wasn't simply dangerous. It was psychologically obliterating. It broke the will to resist, regardless of training, experience, or personal courage. Rommel acknowledged this directly. He wrote that American superiority in artillery, and more critically in ammunition supply, had shattered defensive lines and made sustained resistance impossible on multiple occasions. The numbers behind American artillery were staggering. A single infantry division fielded 48 artillery tubes, 36 howitzers of 105 mm and 12 heavier 155 mm pieces. At Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, more than 300 heavy guns were concentrated behind American positions. On December 22nd alone, they fired over 10,000 rounds. At the 9th Army's crossing of the Roer River in March 1945, 2,070 American guns delivered around 1,000 rounds per minute during the opening bombardment, over 65,000 rounds in total. Germany could not match this volume. By mid-war, German artillery units were rationing shells, tracking expenditures closely, and often unable to provide the fire support their infantry needed. American units burned through ammunition at rates German quartermaster officers would have considered physically impossible. This wasn't waste, it was doctrine. American planners had made a conscious decision. Industrial output was more replaceable than trained soldiers, and they built their tactics around that choice. The second arm that made American forces uniquely dangerous was air power. German soldiers on the Western Front developed a specific visceral dread they described with a single compound word: Jabotod, death by fighter bomber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the primary instrument of that terror. These massive American fighters flew more than 545,000 combat sorties during the war. They dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs on German targets while sustaining a loss rate of just 0.7% per mission. From D-Day to final surrender, Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of tens of thousands of railcars, locomotives, armored vehicles, and trucks. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, Allied aircraft flew over 14,600 sorties. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 320 serviceable fighters in all of France. The production gap behind that imbalance was insurmountable. The United States alone built around 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany's peak annual production reached roughly 39,800. Total American wartime aircraft production exceeded 295,000. Germany produced approximately 116,000. Between January and May 1944, over 2,200 German fighter pilots were killed in combat. In May of that year alone, 25% of Germany's entire fighter pilot force died. Monthly aircraft losses ran between 43 and 56% of available strength. Experienced pilots who had survived years of war were dying faster than trained replacements could be produced. German ground forces learned to treat clear daylight skies as a source of dread that shaped every tactical decision they made. Any movement on open roads during daylight drew immediate attack. Truck convoys moved only at night. Armored formations needed hours to cover distances that could have been crossed in minutes without the constant threat from above. American air power didn't just kill German soldiers. It paralyzed logistics, forced exhausting night movements, and prevented the timely reinforcement of positions that might otherwise have held. Together, artillery and air power gave American forces an asymmetric advantage that no amount of German tactical skill could neutralize. German commanders could outmaneuver American infantry in a forest. They could not outmaneuver 300 artillery pieces and 1,500 fighter bombers. This was the mathematical reality that Rommel, Rundstedt, and Manteuffel all eventually committed to paper in their after-action reports and private correspondence. By the summer of 1944, the strategic picture had shifted dramatically. The Allied landings at Normandy on June 6 had opened the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. American, British, and Canadian forces had secured a solid beachhead against fierce German resistance. The logistical machinery of the world's most heavily industrialized nation was now running at full capacity, pouring men, equipment, and ammunition onto French soil at a rate German planners knew they could not sustain against. And yet, within weeks of the landing, the American advance had nearly ground to a halt. Not because of German armor or artillery, not because of Luftwaffe attacks, but because of hedges. Ancient Norman hedgerows, known locally as bocage, had covered this landscape for centuries, and they presented an obstacle American military planners had not adequately studied or anticipated. The bocage consisted of fields enclosed by earthen mounds 4 to 15 feet high, their bases reinforced by centuries of root growth into walls of vegetation so dense they were essentially impenetrable to men and machines alike. Each field was a natural fortress. Each gap in the hedge was a killing ground, covered by German machine guns and Panzerfaust rockets. A handful of experienced German infantrymen could pin down an entire American battalion for hours, forcing frontal assaults across open ground with no cover and no room to maneuver. Tanks, the primary instrument of American offensive power, were nearly useless in this terrain. When a Sherman tried to climb an earthen embankment, it exposed its underside to any anti-tank weapon on the other side. The few natural gaps between fields were blocked, mined, and covered by interlocking fire. Artillery couldn't locate targets hidden in the enclosed fields. Air support couldn't distinguish friend from enemy in the tightly compressed hedgerow fighting. The casualty figures from this period were sobering. Between certain Norman villages, American forces suffered around 1,000 casualties for every kilometer of advance. At that rate, the breakout from Normandy would take not months, but years. The Americans had the firepower, the logistics, and the industrial depth. What they suddenly and urgently lacked was a solution to a problem that no amount of shells or aircraft could solve directly. What happened next revealed something essential about how the American military worked, something its German opponents had not yet fully reckoned with. Across the American sector, individual units began independently developing solutions to the hedgerow problem. Engineers experimented with explosives. Tankers tried different approaches to breaching the earthen walls. The effort was decentralized, simultaneous, and driven entirely by frontline necessity, not institutional direction from above. The solution that worked came from an unlikely source. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Coolin III served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, attached to 5th Corps under 1st Army. He had been a civilian just months before arriving in France. According to military historian Max Hastings, the original idea came from an ordinary soldier named Roberts, who suggested during a discussion that steel teeth mounted on the front of a tank might cut through a hedgerow the way a saw cuts through wood. Others dismissed the idea. Coolin did not. Working in a field repair shop, using scrap steel salvaged from German beach obstacles, the iron check hedgehogs that had lined the Normandy beaches, Coolin fabricated 4 steel prongs and welded them to the front hull of a Sherman tank. When the tank drove into a hedgerow at speed, the prongs bit into the earthen base and anchored the front end, preventing it from riding up and exposing its belly. The Sherman then drove straight through the wall of roots and soil, emerging on the other side with its guns ready. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration. In his memoir, he described the hedgerow exploding outward as the Sherman burst through to the other side. He immediately ordered mass production. Work continued around the clock under camouflage netting to preserve secrecy from German aerial reconnaissance. By the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25, just 11 days after Bradley's demonstration, 3 out of every 5 tanks in 1st Army had been fitted with what became known as the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter. Over 500 devices were built in that 11-day window. In the German Army, a sergeant would not have been encouraged to develop tactical innovations on his own. Such matters belonged to officers and engineers. In the British Army, the suggestion would have moved through proper channels and been studied by committees. In the American Army, a sergeant from New Jersey built a prototype in a field and saw it deployed across an entire army in less than 2 weeks. That difference was not incidental. It was structural, and it was decisive. By December 1944, the Allied advance had pushed to the German frontier. American, British, and Canadian forces stood along the Siegfried Line, exhausted from months of continuous fighting, but confident that Germany's final collapse was near. Intelligence assessments suggested the Wehrmacht was too depleted to mount serious offensive operations. Most Allied commanders believed the war would be over by spring. They were about to be reminded, at enormous cost, that it wasn't finished yet. On December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German troops launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack struck along an 80-mile front held by 4 American divisions, 2 newly arrived and untested, 2 exhausted from recent combat. It was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France in 1940. And it struck the weakest point in the Allied line with armor reserves that American intelligence had entirely failed to identify. The initial results were exactly what German planners had intended. American units along the front were overrun or surrounded. Communications collapsed across large sections of the line. Entire regiments were cut off and destroyed. German spearheads drove westward through the frozen forest, capturing fuel dumps, bypassing fortified positions, and threatening to split the Allied armies and seize the vital port of Antwerp. For roughly 48 hours, the situation looked genuinely catastrophic. What happened next demonstrated, more clearly than any previous engagement, why German commanders had come to fear American forces, despite their early impression of them as amateurs. At every critical point along the German advance, American units made decisions that disrupted the German timetable in ways the offensive plan could not absorb. At Elsenborn Ridge, on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, the 99th Infantry Division, untested and in the line for the first time, held its positions against the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, personally chosen by Hitler to deliver the decisive breakthrough. First Lieutenant Lyle Buch, Jr. commanded an 18-man reconnaissance platoon from the 394th Infantry Regiment. His unit, reinforced by 4 artillery forward observers, found itself facing an entire German parachute battalion of around 500 soldiers. Buch's men held for hours, inflicting an estimated 92 casualties and delaying the armored spearhead of SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. The unit was later recognized as the most decorated American unit of its size in the entire war. Behind the infantry positions at Elsenborn Ridge, more than 300 artillery pieces concentrated their fires on the approach routes used by the attacking German divisions. The techniques developed at Fort Sill and refined through 2 years of combat in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France were now applied at full scale. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army on the southern route, later admitted in post-war assessments that the German counteroffensive failed in large part because its right flank struck a defensive wall it could not break. At the vital road junction of Saint-Vite, the 7th Armored Division, under Brigadier General Bruce Clark, held for nearly a week against overwhelming German forces, throwing the German timetable into a disorder from which it never recovered. Eisenhower later assessed the defense of Saint-Vite as a turning point of the entire battle. The town had no particular strategic value in itself. What it had was roads, and the Germans needed those roads on a precise schedule to reach the Meuse River before Allied reserves could close the gap. But the most famous American stand of the entire battle came at Bastogne. This small Belgian crossroads town controlled access to the main road network through the Ardennes. Whoever held it controlled movement through the entire region. The 101st Airborne Division rushed to Bastogne from rest camps in France, and elements of the 10th Armored Division found themselves completely surrounded, outnumbered roughly 4-1, short of winter clothing, low on ammunition, and unable to evacuate their wounded. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag, carrying a written ultimatum from their corps commander. It warned that American forces faced annihilation and demanded surrender within 2 hours. The message was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander. According to multiple witnesses in the command post, McAuliffe read the ultimatum, crumpled it, tossed it toward a wastebasket, and muttered a single dismissive word before turning back to his maps. When his staff tried to draft a formal reply, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard suggested that the general's initial reaction had already said everything that needed to be said. The official response, typed on a single sheet and handed to the waiting German officers, contained exactly one word in capital letters. That word was nuts. When the German delegation asked whether this was a favorable or unfavorable answer, the American officer escorting them back to their lines clarified the position plainly. It meant, go to hell. The 100 first held Bastogne. On December 26th, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. Patton's army had been attacking eastward into the Saar when the Ardennes offensive began. At the Verdun Conference on December 19th, he promised Eisenhower he could pull 3 divisions out of active combat, turn them 90 degrees north, and attack within 48 hours. He delivered on that promise. Military historians have studied the maneuver for decades. The answer lay in Patton's habit of preparing for contingencies he had anticipated before they materialized. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. American casualties reached around 80,000 in total, including roughly 19,200 killed. German losses were comparable in number and catastrophic in strategic terms. Hundreds of tanks, assault guns, and experienced soldiers that a collapsing German war economy could not replace. Winston Churchill called it, without exaggeration, the greatest American battle of the war. The question German commanders asked themselves in the final months of the war wasn't why they had lost individual battles. They understood those losses in tactical terms. What genuinely troubled them was why American forces had grown progressively more effective after every setback, while German forces, despite moments of brilliant tactical success, had grown consistently weaker. The answer was institutional, and it reached into every level of how the American military was organized, trained, and how it processed failure. The United States Army had built a systematic feedback loop that no comparable military organization of that era matched for speed or comprehensiveness. The Army Ground Forces published training bulletins, including combat lessons and battle experiences, that rapidly distributed frontline innovations across all theaters simultaneously. Observer teams regularly inspected combat units and reported on what worked and what didn't. That information flowed back to training commands inside the United States, where programs were continuously updated based on actual combat experience, not peacetime theory. The pace of adaptation was measurable and consistent. Training cycles were adjusted repeatedly based on battlefield reports. The basic training period stood at 13 weeks before Pearl Harbor, was compressed to 8 weeks after the attack to meet urgent manpower needs, then expanded to 17 weeks by August 1943, when combat experience showed that undertrained soldiers were suffering avoidable casualties, then adjusted again to 15 weeks during the Bulge Crisis, when replacements were urgently needed. Each change reflected specific lessons from specific battles. Nothing was adjusted on assumption. The contrast with German practice was stark. While American programs evolved continuously based on frontline feedback, German replacement training deteriorated steadily as the war went on. By 1944, German replacements often arrived at frontline units after just weeks of instruction, sometimes without having fired their assigned weapons. The institutional learning that made American forces progressively more capable was entirely absent from the collapsing German replacement system. Where Americans sent observer teams forward and published lessons learned bulletins within weeks of each engagement, German units kept successful tactics to themselves. Officers who acknowledged failures risked punishment rather than promotion. The cultural difference was fundamental. The American system was designed from the ground up to treat failure as information. The German system, particularly after Hitler's increasing interference from 1941 onward, treated failure as something to be assigned, concealed, or punished away. The German army had built its early wartime reputation on a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, which gave subordinate commanders enormous freedom to improvise as long as they achieved their assigned objectives. A battalion commander facing an unexpected situation was expected to use his judgment without waiting for permission from above. This flexibility had made German forces the most tactically effective army in the world during the war's opening years. Hitler's growing interference systematically destroyed that advantage. His December 1941 halt order, forbidding any retreats during the Soviet winter counteroffensive, began a pattern that grew steadily more restrictive. By 1943 and 1944, blanket no-retreat orders had stripped meaningful initiative from every level of command. Commanders who argued for tactical withdrawals were relieved, or worse. Ideological loyalty replaced professional competence as the primary criterion for advancement. German units that might otherwise have adapted were frozen in place by rigid orders from a headquarters hundreds of miles from the front. The production gap underlying all of this was, in the end, insurmountable. The United States alone produced around 295,000 aircraft during the war, American factories built roughly 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. They manufactured over 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition and approximately 1 billion artillery rounds. American industry produced over 2 million military trucks that kept Allied forces supplied across 3 continents. The Red Ball Express truck convoy system, at its peak, operated around 6,000 vehicles and delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies daily to advancing combat units. American doctrine had made a deliberate, calculated choice. It would trade material for lives. Combat analysts found that American forces expended substantially more ammunition per engagement than any other army in the war. This wasn't waste or lack of discipline. It was a calculated strategy built on the recognition that industrial output could be replaced and trained soldiers could not. When an American infantry platoon came under fire, every man had been drilled not merely to close with the enemy through maneuver, but to call in supporting fires and let artillery and aircraft do the killing. The approach wasn't subtle. It wasn't elegant by European military standards, but it worked with a consistency that German commanders found increasingly impossible to counter. The conclusion German officers eventually reached, reluctantly, only after enormous losses had made it unavoidable, was not about the individual American soldier. By most reasonable measures, German infantry training produced men more skilled in fieldcraft, marksmanship, and small unit tactics. German officers were often more experienced and more creative tactically. German equipment was more advanced in several categories. None of that mattered when the opponent could mass 300 artillery pieces behind a ridgeline and deliver 10,000 rounds in a single day. None of it mattered when any movement in daylight brought fighter bombers screaming down within minutes. None of it mattered when every German tactical success was met by American reinforcement and counterattack before exhausted troops could consolidate any gain. The German fear of American forces was ultimately a fear of an institution, an organization built to learn from failure rather than conceal it, to reward initiative rather than punish it, to adapt faster than any opponent could anticipate, and to back all of it with industrial resources that no nation on earth in 1944 could match. That combination, systematic learning, encouraged initiative, and overwhelming material depth, was what German soldiers were actually describing when they used words like unpredictable and terrifying in their post-war interrogations. They had expected amateurs. What they found after Kasserine, after El Guettar, after the Bocage, after Bastogne, was something they had no established doctrine for fighting. An army that got stronger every time it was hit. That is the full picture. From the disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 to the elimination of the Bulge in January 1945, American forces followed a consistent pattern, absorbing setbacks, identifying what had failed, correcting it, and returning to the fight more capable than before. It wasn't a glamorous way to wage war, but it was effective in a way that outlasted every tactical advantage Germany possessed. Thank you for watching this through to the end. It genuinely matters. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel. There is more ahead.